So I'm going to start by saying I'm excited to be here today. It's always great when a plan, or in this instance, a guide, comes together. And this has been a long process. I thought I'd start with a little bit of history and also remind everybody of what the objectives are of this project, which is up on the slide that you all can see. It was we began, and so just so you understand the historical context, we began back in 2015, really talking to our vice presidents for research, provost, about public access issues. It even goes back before then, because I remember discussions around public access to journals beginning when NIH was first looking at making journals accessible through PubMed Central. But in 2015, there really became a real focus on data, and there was still some concerns about public access. We created a working group, which Sarah Nusser, who's already been mentioned, co-chaired with Lisa Lynch, the provost of Brandeis University. You'll hear in a little bit from Dan Reed. He was one of the members of that group when he was a vice president for research at the University of Iowa. That group worked to develop a set of recommendations for institutions, and we did focus really on data at the end of the day, not on access to publications, because we saw that as really where there were growing challenges, concerns, and made recommendations on what institutions could do, what institutions could do working across their institutions, and then provided some recommendations related to how perhaps on the federal agency side there could be things done to support efforts for data access on our campuses. That then led to the first, and so you see the objective. We really wanted to, in this project, advance the efforts and to accelerate and develop a set of guidelines to help institutions really move forward on this and draw upon the expertise that exists at our campuses, and to do that, to get to this guide. So if I can have the next slide. To get us there, we created a steering committee, and they are listed here. I will not go through everybody's name, but I know many of them are participating in today's summit, and certainly want to thank all of them. In particular, I will just mention Greg Madden, who had been at Penn State and changed jobs at one point, but he did start out, and he was the chair of the steering committee also on our planning team, and now Sarah Nusser has assumed that role. But I want to thank all the steering committee members for their support. They've been involved in providing feedback, input, as we've developed the guide that you now all have seen the pre-publication print of. Next slide. Just to mention the team that has really worked on this, and many of these folks have already been mentioned. You heard first from Emily Miller, who has been moderating the session today. We've talked about Sarah Nusser. I want to recognize Mira O'Malley from AAU, who's behind the scenes, as well as, and she's been a part of our team. Casey Redd from APLU, who has really APLU has been a tremendous partner. Going back to, by the way, after we did that report, APLU with us led an effort to bring in teams of 30, representing 30 different institutions. Some of you are part of those teams that we brought to that first workshop that we had on accelerating public access to data before we then pursued the second national summit. I want to recognize Bob Samores, who's been our consultant and helping us with development of the guide. We'll skip me. And I also want to recognize Katie Steen, who has recently left AAU to go work for Spark. We had actually stolen her from Spark to come work at AAU, and now she's returned to Spark. But I think we're going to keep Katie involved in these issues, given where she's working. So with that, next slide. Just again, I've kind of gone through this. We started with that after the initial working group completed its work, we had this, the workshop that I mentioned, that was in 2018. And then we got going and decided a guide would be the next positive step, because some of those groups, we really wanted those teams to keep going. Some of them, we actually did a survey, and not all of them were able to keep going after they left that workshop that AAU did with APLU in 2018. We thought a guide might be the next step to keep things going, to push us down that way. We had a first, we reconvened some of those 30 teams that we brought together. Then we had our first national summit, which many of you participated in back, I believe, and time all runs together, but it would have been before the pandemic because we were able to do it in person. And it was in February of 2019. We were supposed to originally have the national summit back in September, but knowing that we were all in a virtual world and not knowing exactly what we would, what the future would hold, we then moved to reconvening those 30 institutions that were part of the acceleration conference, and to try and get their input on a draft guide. And we took that input, and then we essentially ended up where we are at today, and have really made a lot of progress in the guide. So let me just, if we can go to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about and give you an overview of what's actually in the guide. And of course, we begin with the introduction, which just really talks, and then part one of the guide, we start to frame and explain why public access to research data is important. What's the value proposition? And we've already mentioned some of the reasons, and you all know them: reproducibility, rigor, to ensure public trust, and to advance science and innovation. Additionally, we want to make sure that, and this is particularly true when I talk to the vice presidents for research, that they have the tools to make sure they are in compliance with what the federal requirements now are from the research agencies. One thing we know, though, and we've done a lot of work thinking about, how do we achieve real cultural change? And that's going to require not only the folks who, of course, in AAU and APLU we represent, the presidents and senior administrators, but it's going to require changes in how faculty think about the importance of the data and what the value proposition is to them. So we've given some thought to how do you affect and change faculty, and do that through multiple mechanisms. So you're looking at top down, bottom up, and also departments have a big role as we talk about the middle out, and how do you get departments talking about the importance of data access. Part two of the guide really starts to talk about how to make data sharing a priority, and how to make that priority visible for at the institutional level, and also then laying out a plan for moving forward. So part of this is coming and getting senior administrators to talk about it and send a message down that data sharing is a priority for our campus, encouraging departments to actually engage their faculty in discussions about how to do it, creating a structure and perhaps a committee, as we suggested in an initial workshop, that's composed of key people who are going to ensure that data is accessible on a campus, from representatives from the provost office to the vice president to the research office, to the library, to the IT and chief information officers and their staff. So bringing all those people together in one committee to really then do the next thing, which is develop a plan for the campus on how to ensure data access and stewardship. Part three of the guide, we talk about some areas of implementation and what we feel, and make recommendations again for how campuses can do this. And that includes establishing updates to the current data policy or related guidelines, identifying existing or needed research data services and the expertise on your campuses, and making sure those are available and linked and accessible to the people who need that expertise and those resources. Cost and costs are a big one here. How do we pay to ensure that data is accessible, and what resources are available? So that's got to be a part of any implementation effort to ensure data access on a campus. Building the capacity to ensure data access and the skills required for good data stewardship. And finally, this is where, again, trying to figure out how you get and from the top down push and encourage faculty to make their data accessible and change that, really achieve that cultural change at that grassroots level. So building support for embracing research, the campus policy, and the notion that sharing data is important to advancing science. And then we have a conclusion with essential questions. The essential questions are also helpful as a benchmark for campuses as they try and figure out where they stand, what questions should they be trying to answer to move their data access program forward. Next slide. So another thing we've done, and you'll see this in the guide, which now we've got a graphically laid out guide. We still have a few things to finish up in it, but you'll see that we've defined terms, and that is done throughout the guide, and the terms there are listed that we have provided definitions for, so everybody knows exactly at least our interpretation of what we are talking about when it comes to some of these key terms in the guide. And if I can have the next slide. There are a number of examples that are illustrative and helpful in terms of how campuses or how universities, and I will not go through these, but they are mentioned there in the guide that I think will be helpful to everybody. And we are talking about, after this workshop, after this summit, doing a webinar series where we'll feature and go into some more details on other examples we found that are, I think, exemplary to kind of keep the momentum going after we release the guide. So just to foreshadow that we plan to have some additional webinars in follow-up to this summit. I do want to mention in the chat, I think you can now access, because it wasn't available until just this morning, the graphically laid out guide. So you'll see that it's a little bit prettier than the version you might have seen that we sent out last week, so you could read the content of the guide. But I'm really happy, having looked at the layout. I think it's all coming together very nicely, and very excited about where we are at. So I think at this point, we're going to move on to our panel discussion. And I just need to make sure we have all our panelists and that we're ready to go. I see Dan and Roger, and we just need Amy, and then we'll get started. So,
I'm here.
Great. So, first of all, I want to thank our panelists, and let me just give you, I'm going to do very brief introductions. We have, and what we want to do with this panel was have a group that represented different perspectives from our campuses to react to what's in the guide and give you their perspective on it from where they sit. And so to do that, we have Dan Reed, who I already mentioned was a part of our initial working group back in 2016, who's moved on from being a vice president for research to now he is senior vice president of academic affairs at the University of Utah. So Dan, we're great. Thank you for joining us. We have Roger Wakimoto, who is the vice chancellor for research at UCLA, and Amy Nurnberger, who is program head for data management at MIT in the library. So with that, I'm going to just go right into asking asking for a brief reaction from each of you, and I know you've gotten a chance to look at the content of the guide to what it says and the recommendations, and give us just briefly your perspective, given the respective administrative role that you have on your campus. And I'm going to start, Dan, with you.
All right. Well, thanks, Toby. And let me say a huge thanks to the group that's continued to work on this since my initial participation as a VP for research. I do think it hits the key issues. I think you touched on something that I think is really important, and that's addressing the cultural issues. I mean, my experience in administrative roles is usually that culture eats process for breakfast. And so this mix of ensuring that faculty are engaged and understand the value proposition for this, as opposed to it feeling like an administrative mandate, but that they see both the intellectual advantages to them individually, but as you touched on, the community advantages about impressing upon people reproducibility, and actually the broader sort of community engagement, as I view our public service missions, to explain why scholarship and research is important to the future of our society. And I think touching on the pragmatics as well, the operational issues, and certainly the cost issues. I guess one quick thing I would say before I hand the floor over, of course, is we know that the nature of publication is in flux concurrently. And so how we think about the nature of publication models and support and its correlation with open access, and those models as we think about the mix of pay to subscribe versus pay to publish and that conversation, that how this intersects with those, it's a piece of that broader story. But kudos for the document. I think it's a really great blueprint for campus conversations.
Dan, before we move to Roger, I want to ask a follow-up, because one thing as I talk to folks, and it has to do with cultural change, and I'm interested in your perspective from a chief academic officer's perspective, is there is this view that campus change can happen if a president or a provost just snaps their fingers and says, this is the way it's got to be. And I often explain that no, because faculty, the provost says turn right and faculty turn left. Or, and I'm just interested in your perspective as a chief academic officer. What is your role? What can you do? And what do you think are your constraints in terms of achieving that cultural change that's necessary and we know is necessary to move the ball forward?
So I often describe our leadership role by analogy with the old vignette from Tom Sawyer, where the fence whitewashing takes place. And it's really about convincing people it's their idea, not your idea, so they're emotionally invested in it. I actually have a campus task force looking at the intersection of the future of libraries and these open access data issues. And it's really important that you get broad-based perspective, town halls, opportunities for conversation, let people be heard, and how those individual perspectives shape the collective. It's kind of how you build grassroots consensus. And so, yes, you can lead off with things from central administration, but the old proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, is really apt. And so that's why I led with culture. It is building consensus and an understanding about what matters.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Roger, let's turn to you. And you, of course, are, as a chief research officer, have also responsibility for any compliance requirements that come along with this. I'd love to hear your perspective on the guide and a reaction.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And by the way, I hope you guys on Open Publications read Science Magazine, because we have a big blurb about the UC system breaking down the Elsevier, and we were at an impasse, and the impasse is broken and we won. So I think that's great for Open Publications. It's nice when the UC system has 10% of all of Elsevier's publications. It means they got to listen to us at some level. So these are my comments on the document. I think it's a great document. It's really a tour de force I applaud the effort, and I strongly support it. I mean, there's no question I strongly support it. Some background comments and a few suggestions for consideration, and then I'll end on another note. One is, I think you can start with saying that COVID-19 is a brilliant example of why open data and open publications are so important. I think the whole community benefited, and I think opened a lot of people's eyes about the value of what I think a lot of people now have been calling open scholarship. Point to another agency, I think NASA is another shining example with their open data policy in the way they mined it with the citizen science projects, where they just threw it out there, they let the public grab it, and the public came up with discoveries of planets and comets. I mean, this was just mind-boggling and stimulated so much interest. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the document, but I do want to highlight, there's the business case. Certainly from my discipline, I can tell you that NOAA, because it essentially puts weather data freely available for anybody, it has led to a nearly $8 billion private weather industry. You all have seen part of it, the Weather Channel. They wouldn't exist if NOAA did not provide the weather data in an open and free accessibility. I will tell you, though, that there are still some challenges we have to overcome, and I'll just look back to my time at NSF. At NSF, they always support open data. And in my directorate that I supported, let me give you an example of a hurdle that we still need to figure out. We supported major facilities, state-of-the-art MREFC projects, instrumentation, all open data. I'll just list a couple: critical zone observatories. We helped with NEON, the National Ecological Observing Network, ALTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, and OOI, the Oceans Observatory Initiative, all firmly behind open data. But the challenge I had was no one can go in there and plot all of these data sets on one map. You can plot each one individually, but it seems like we should be at the stage where you can integrate all these data sets and bring them up all on the screen. And we hadn't gotten to that point. So it just shows you that open data is part of the solution. There are issues with common data formats, et cetera, that we still are struggling with. So I just wanted to highlight that. Kind suggestions after reading the document, because this was the first time I read it. I guess I would have liked to have seen just a little more emphasis on open software and code. Again, from my perspective, in atmospheric sciences, we have community climate modeling, we have community weather modeling, and the emphasis is on community. These are open source software routines, and as a result, the community weather model has been downloaded by 30,000 users from 150 countries. Many of these countries simply could never have their own predictive weather model had this code not been put out for anyone to download. And the additional benefit is these users can develop modules that then feed back to the model and improve the model. And so you essentially have an army of users that are actually making the model better with time. So I'll just throw that out. Another idea that I think there needs to be a little bit more thought of, and maybe I'm in the minority on this, I'm not sure I'm convinced that all data have to be archived in perpetuity. I do know that some data do. I mean, LIGO data is a good example. You never want LIGO data to disappear. But you know, the single PI that has a small desktop, maybe through the life cycle of the award and maybe a few years after that, but I'm not sure how much we gain by saying that that data must be stored forever. So again, I'll just throw that out. My last point is just to emphasize something that was said in the document that I couldn't agree more strongly about. I think a good starting point is focusing on research data underlying scholarly publication, because I really see a great nexus of agencies simply requiring that when you publish the data, you're going to have to link it to the data. I think that's easy for agencies to do. I think then we can really talk to scholarly societies to say that in your publications, you should also require this. I think that's I know I've talked about that with my scholarly societies, and they haven't been against that. And finally, I think we can talk to institutes of higher education, promoting faculty to endorse such behavior. It just seems like low-hanging fruit. I think it's a natural or where many things come together. So I'll stop there, Toby.
Great, thanks, Roger. I'm going to turn to Amy now and get your perspective from where you sit, working in data management and with the libraries.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, I sit working with data management, with researchers, with institutions, with international and national organizations. And I want to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this event. First of all, I think this document is a nice piece of work. There's a lovely summation of where we need to go in the second paragraph. And there are three major themes I wanted to highlight within this. The ideas around inclusion, collaboration, and responsibility. These are going to give us greater access to research and scholarship and really put us on the road to equity when it comes to the idea of scholarship itself as well. To echo what Roger certainly has said, thinking about inclusion, I'd like to see us include more than just the data. Absolutely. We need a broader definition of research materials. This is what's necessary to truly support research usefulness, efficiency, and accountability. I think we all acknowledge at this point in time that an article is really the advertisement of the scholarship. And what we really need to understand the scholarship is all of the executable material behind that, whether that's code or script or materials or protocols or other parts of what we might consider pieces of the research or research outputs. I'd also like to encourage everyone to think broadly about who should be involved in these conversations at your institution, in your community, and in the greater academic ecosystem as well. This guide gives some really great pointers, and I would direct you to some previous work in these areas, such as Ricky Irway's 2013 white paper on how to effectively start research data and data management conversations at your institution. In the guide itself, I would strongly suggest that step 2 of part 3, identify research data services and expertise at your institution, be moved up in your process. That should be in part 2. Figure out who those experts are, because right now, every single institution has a center of expertise available to them today at their institution. Go to your libraries. These are creative and effective collaborators. Your libraries have been working on issues of research data and public access for years, providing systems and services. Their expertise is linked to institutional, regional, national, and international networks of knowledge because, again, your libraries really are great collaborators. So partner with them, reach out to them. Don't waste these concentrations of developed excellence and expertise. In that same spirit of collaboration, this work is going to take partnership across your institutions and involve a lot of parts. Connect with those that have established those local relationships. Those networks exist, and continue that engagement around the tough problems of data when it comes to restricted data and industry partnerships, because these are questions about which data should be open and how open should data be. You know, we like to say as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And there's some really good efforts around that in trying to make the overhead a little bit lighter by developing templates for data use agreements and data transfer agreements. So these conversations are going to need to include libraries, IT, faculty, department heads, hitting at all of these levels of administration across the university, across the institution, to get that groundswell of participation and ownership in this idea that data is an asset of the institution, that data is a way that the institution shows itself and advances its missions. And of course, institutions, we don't have to do this alone. We don't have to reproduce those systems of inefficiencies that we are already familiar with from our experience with publications and articles. So look for those collaborators across your institutional partners. Form the consortia, invest in the shared resources. Especially look beyond the borders of the United States. There are some great examples out there, whether that's the European Open Science Cloud, the Canadian Network for Data Management, Portage, inside the United States, the Data Curation Network, shared resources like OSF. Search out and use the work that's already been done, the expertise that has been developed. For instance, not a single institution probably needs to do a needs survey at your institution. Gobin and Griffin have done a wonderful overview of these, and there's no need to repeat this effort and spend those resources. Use what's out there. But do be aware of those who offer an easy solution to take this problem of data management and data sharing off your hands. Rather, I encourage you to find those partners who share your goals values, missions around advancing research, education, and service, and work with them to achieve that cultural change. We know it's a systemic change. It's not going to be achieved by one department, one institution, one discipline, or one stakeholder. We have to work together on this, and we need the entire academic system to work together on it. Fortunately, these conversations have been happening, and this is reflected in the guide in the way that we see responsibility portrayed for the roles of institutions. So yeah, go ahead, articulate data sharing as a priority at your institution. That's important, but go further than that. Be bold in the ways that we can be bold, that we often aren't bold, and really take that risk at your institution about actually making it easy for your research community to do the good work. Actually make it easy and rewarding for your research community to do the right things that we're asking them to do. So a basic thing for your infrastructure, persistent identifiers, what you were talking about, Roger, not being able to integrate data sets. A lot of this goes back to good metadata. And one of the basic pieces of metadata is a persistent identifier for authors, for institutions, for research data sets, for other parts of research materials. Make these things part of your systems. Make them just normal. Everyone should have an ORCID. Everyone should have that identifier. You should have a DOI minting service or some other persistent identifier minting service at your institution. Think about those incentives, whether you're looking at promotion and tenure systems and how those might be leveraged, or even thinking about, what do you do for your internal grants? Maybe it means creating some internal grants that reward data sharing or provide money for data preparation. Maybe it means changing some of those grants. So if your grant, you're like, here's your seed grant, go out, add that requirement that data produced with this. Think about making that publicly accessible data. So it just becomes part of that normal conversation about what's expected in our institutions around data. And lastly, one thing I cannot express enough, and I left this to last because it's really important, but we shouldn't generally leave it to last because it is so important. Don't leave this until part 3. Funding. Have those conversations ahead of time because it's a difficult conversation, and difficult conversations don't get better when we put them off, but we need funding and support for the people who have been doing this work. We need support at the institutional level because data sharing is the institution. So consider central funding for some of the work that's being done here. Consider making these baseline services and systems development and maintenance as part of what is served by your indirects. Fund the people that are doing this work, thinking about data stewards, data professionals, and the systems that are necessary to support this work. There are a lot of different successful models that are out there. We can draw on these and learn from these and figure out what's going to work best for each of our institutions in these spaces. So thank you again for that. And I'm sorry if I went a little bit over in my comments, but I do also want to offer thanks to Sherry Lake, Susan Ivey, John Petters, and Megan O'Donnell, who are members of that strong libraries-driven research data community that I mentioned before, for their contributions.
Great, thank you, Amy. I do want to encourage everybody, and you're already doing this, please comment in the chat, ask questions of the other group. We'll see here if we have a second or two for a few questions at the end. If we do, we'll take one or two, and people could just raise their hand if they want to ask a question. We will also then move after our break into breakout groups where you'll get a chance to discuss and comment more on some of these issues. I want to ask one more question of all of you, and that is that the guide was created to inspire action. So what I'm interested in knowing from each of you is there one thing that's recommended in the guide that you'll either do or where you already feel on your campus you've already taken initiative and it would serve as a good example for others? And so Dan, I'll start with you and then we'll go to Roger and Amy.
Well, I mentioned that we have a campus task force in flight. I think that's one of the things, and there's some great examples of that in the guide as well about the social processes and the kind of questions that you mentioned as the outset. I want to echo a couple of things that Amy said. Don't reinvent the wheel. Build on what has been done before. Build some coalitions of the willing. And that goes back to the socialization, and leverage the assets that you already have, whether it be your libraries or your computing and IT facilities, the folks that are professionals in that. I do think one thing I mentioned in the chat that's really important is to understand that different disciplines are at different points along the journey in this space. One of my old friends in astronomy, Alex Saleh from Hopkins, used to joke that the great thing about astronomy data was it was worthless. And what he meant was it wasn't encumbered by privacy or intellectual property issues. It certainly had intellectual competitive advantage, but recognizing that there are differences across disciplines and different issues around that is important. And as I noted in the chat as well, help people understand that perfect can be the enemy of good. And so starting with something is really important. And I guess the last thing I would say is I'd echo again what Amy said. Owning up to costs at the outset is important. And I think the social issue that the document touches on as well about helping people understand why it's in their interest is really important as opposed to burden. And one of those which was mentioned in the chat is highlighting the research opportunities that it actually creates for scholars, because I think what we all know is true is increasingly advantage accrues to the fusion of data across disciplines as we think about complex societal issues. And in our disciplinary depth, we sometimes lose sight of that. So highlighting that sort of connection, I think, is important. But the money does matter. And certainly as we see financial strains on higher education and in this COVID world, being honest about prioritization, I think is an important piece. And I'm just looking at my notes to see if there's anything else. I think one last thing I'd say about the social aspect and disciplines to remember is that public data creates a democratization of intellectual inquiry in ways that we don't often think about. So if you as a scholar have unique infrastructure that can produce data that no one else has, you in some sense may perceive that as a competitive advantage. Public data opens things in a different kind of way to allow people to say, not who has advantage because they have unique data, but who can ask better questions. And that is really related to the inclusive nature about how we expand access. And one last quick thing I would say, wearing my National Science Board hat as we think about the missing millions of engaging scholars in creative influence, we have to think about the mechanisms that ensure a broader cross-section of the US population has those opportunities. And communicating to people that this will help enable that is really important.
Dan, thanks. That was, I think, some very good comments. I want to call out, one of the things we talk about, the culture change, the top down, the bottom up, middle out, departments and units. We also know something else, and that's sideways in. And so AAU and APLU, we talk to provosts and presidents. I'll give a shout out. I know Shelley Stahl is here from the AGU, and they've been doing work with disciplinary societies because that's where faculty live. And it's really important when we talk about the differences. I think it's critical we engage the faculty in those disciplinary societies and what's needed. It gets to part of what Roger was saying is how long do you keep data? How long is it needed? And what's necessary for the discipline? I think that's where we got to have some of those important discussions. Shelley has been convening some of the disciplinary societies as a part of AGU, and we've been talking closely and working to promote those discussions as well to complement what we're trying to do with the guide. Roger, let me turn to you.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about what I interpreted as what can I do. And I'll hone in on the section, I think it was called Build Capacity and Skills for Good Research Data Stewardship Practices. I can tell you that I'm already including, because I'm invited every year, open data and also open publications for all onboarding and orientation for new faculty. I mean, that's so easy and it's a no-brainer, so I've already done that. I have also included it, that's why I resonate with the section. I've also included it in the RCR discussions, the responsible conduct of research, because it's very easy to make a connection there. So I'm glad the report talks about things that I'm already doing. One thing that it didn't mention, but I have been doing, and I'll just throw this out there. As you know, there's been almost a tsunami of interest in the university community about data science. and data science initiative, data science institutes. Data science is now being integrated into curricula right and left. And so I've been talking to the people on our campus that have done that and said, you've got to put open data and all the issues associated with open data in these courses. Because I'm worried, or I shouldn't say I'm worried, I think you've got to plant the seeds in the next generation. Some of the very senior faculty can be a little hard to convince, but if you educate the very junior people, the students, on a subject that we're already beginning to talk about, it's just so easy to integrate that into the class itself. And so I think I'll just stop there because those are things that I've been doing, actually doing right now, which I think is helping to move the needle a bit.
Perfect. I'm glad you brought up the training in data science and open data, because I think that's really important, Roger. Amy, let me turn to you.
Thank you for that. I want to build just something on what Roger said, kind of outside of my library's hat, but absolutely with the idea of including at least understanding of why open data and why data management is important in all of the different programs that we teach in. I actually teach a class at Teachers College, Columbia University for their learning analytics program on managing education data. And it's one of the few programs like that in the States that has that type of thing. So I would widely encourage it everywhere. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't expect all of data stewardship to fall on the shoulders of researchers. There are data professionals who are doing this work in partnership with researchers, and they should do this work in partnership with researchers as well. And working in that space and developing the appreciation among our faculty along departmental lines. One of the things that we've done at MIT is we've had an open access task force which dealt with some of the questions around open data, open scholarship, things like that. And one of the recommendations within that was to our departments at MIT to start developing plans for specific departments that encourage open sharing. This really touches on some of the ideas that Daniel led with about acknowledging that different disciplines and different areas are at different places with research data management, with data sharing in and of itself. And it's important to meet them where they are, to work within the context that they understand, to acknowledge those scholarly societies that do have such sway on the developing profession, the professional development, excuse me, of our researchers themselves, and bringing people in at that level to acknowledge, to make their own ownership of these plans something that's meaningful for them. So it's hitting on a lot of those notes around how do we bring motivation in? How do we bring ownership in? How do we work with developing the sense of value? How do we actually make this value by starting to influence what promotion and tenure does? And that starts with having these scholarly societies, having disciplines recognize this within themselves and build that leverage. And we, as institutions and as libraries within institutions, help this by partnering with departments about developing ways to talk about and to work towards the goals that we're going after. And I think Greg Tenenbaum is going to speak a little bit later about some of the work that the NASM Roundtable has been doing in this area as well, working with disciplines, working with departments about developing some of these understandings, about shifting the cultural conversations about what's valuable within a discipline. So at MIT, we're in the pilot stage right now, working with a couple of different departments in developing these plans to encourage open sharing, working closely with the libraries partnership around that. And we have some good hopes. We have some really great directions. We've tried to select departments that come from science, from the humanities, and some of the applications of engineering as well. So that's what we're doing.
Great. We do have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has them, raise your hand or put them in the chat. I might go to a question just to kick things off, because I don't see that anybody has asked a question. I'm interested in your perspective. One of the things I think we feel this guide can help, and I don't know that it's been true, and Roger, it may be, given your compliance role, something I might start with you to address, and that's data management plans. and how we ensure consistency of data management plans. Because I often see them as something the faculty put in their proposals, but I worry a lot about the compliance piece someday, that there will be some inspector general who says, well, I wonder if these universities that agreed they were going to make this data accessible are still doing it, and that the data management plans were met. And if there's not some university kind of agreement as to what should be in those plans, you're going to have a hodgepodge of things, and it's going to be really hard to ensure compliance. So I wonder if you've given that any thought, Roger, or I'd also welcome Dan or Amy's thoughts on this one.
Yeah, you know, Toby, you've hit one thing that kind of makes me stay up at night, because there's a wide variety of data management plans that are submitted. I know NSF, just as I was walking out the door, actually did an inventory of the data, because they were one of the first agencies to require it. And that was one of the conclusions they came up with, that there was a large variety of different types of data management plans. And I think the best way to move forward with this is the university community working with the agencies like NSF to get some sort of understanding of what really is needed, because I'm not sure that the universities alone can solve this. I think this is a really good partnership that we need with the agencies. So that would be my take.
Dan or Amy, or Dan, go ahead, and then I'll come to you, Amy.
Well, I was just going to say, Sarah will remember this, and you will too, Toby. We struggled with that question in the very first workshop, and it's kind of what led to my comment about good beats perfect, because it relates to the triage question. You can't save everything. The costs are exorbitant, particularly in some disciplines, and so you need some mechanism to be thoughtful. But the main thing I want to say is a plea. The great thing about the U.S. ecosystem is we have a diversity of funding mechanisms and research agencies, and that's sometimes also our challenge. That consistency across agencies is also really important, and I think that's one of the things that we have to continue to pursue, because it's rare for research to be solely supported via one venue. And you know, the other is, to your point about auditability, I think, is recognizing that these plans can't be commitments in perpetuity, because that is a perpetually growing unfunded mandate. And that gets back to the marketplace of how one in the end triages data. I do like to remind people that the reason antiques are valuable is because they're rare. And that's because we threw most of that stuff away. And so the art, of course, is in what policies determine how one does curation and triage. But I think we have to keep working on that one.
Great, thanks, Dan. Amy?
Yeah, data management plans is a great question. And one of the really wonderful uses I've seen made of data management plans is actually in some of the Australian universities, where they have a policy of requiring a data management plan for any research that's being done at the institutional level, rather than relying on funders to put this in place. And what they've been able to do with that is actually use the data management plan as a carrot, as a trigger for releasing some of those university resources around what's necessary to successfully manage data, maybe unlocking some more storage or some other resources with that way. But the other things to keep in mind is that data management plans are currently treated as static documents, and they really shouldn't be. A plan, as we all know, never survives contact with reality. And certainly that's true with data management plans. We need to be really looking at those as living documents that change with the research as the research expectations change, and thinking about those as living documents, but also as machine accessible documents and machine auditable documents, that we need to start using the power of the technologies that we have, and thinking about how to make these things useful to our researchers, to our institutions, to our funders as well. We can do better with these than what we have. There's so much potential there that I think we have the opportunity to leverage.
Great, thanks, Amy. We are down to only a couple of minutes left in the session. So what I'm going to do is just invite each one of you to make any final comments you want to make, something that you didn't get a chance to say that you thought of as others have spoke, or any final thoughts before we conclude. And I'll actually start with Amy, and we'll go the opposite direction this time.
I'm just really happy to see these conversations happening at all of these levels. I think that's a great step forward and a wonderful way to really move the needle on how we can make more of our research data publicly accessible and really advanced research as a whole in a brand new way.
Roger?
Oh, let's see. I just thought of something that I was going to say and I forgot. So I guess you've given me an opportunity to mention it. I've actually also tackled the P&T committee, asking them to really seriously consider open data and open publications. And I didn't get beat up. So for anybody else that wants to engage, at least at UCLA, they were open to that discussion. I'm going to have follow-up discussions. I thought that was a really important issue that I didn't mention.
Roger, I'm glad you raised it. You may be getting calls on how you're approaching it, because it seems to be the big question on the table, whether it's this or in multiple areas of changing the way we think of evaluating scholarship. So it's an important issue. I'm glad you're looking at it at UCLA. And Dan, we'll conclude with you.
I just want to make a plea for us to remember that part of our role is to be public intellectuals. And I know given the political fray, we sometimes shy away from that because it can be a messy game. But part of our role is to engage and communicate how research and scholarship builds a better world. And that means engaging our communities, not always necessarily the people who might agree with us, but maybe even more importantly, the people who have somewhat different perspectives, thoughtfully and respectfully. And data and openness are a way to engage people in the come, let's reason together. We may reach different conclusions, but we should begin with a set of shared facts and shared data.
Great. With that, I want to thank all three panelists, Dan, Roger, and Amy. I really appreciate you helping us to reflect on the guide and to kick off this summit. And we're going to now move to, well, maybe a virtual round of applause for our panel members.